everyone. So this is the human controller, special lecture on touch. And so for the 45 minutes, I will tell you a little bit more on the sense of touch itself. So last week you saw elements of perception for vision, for auditory, for vestibular, and how every aspect of perception is integrated into the control of machines. What I want to focus today is really how tactile information, so information from our sense of cutaneous deformation, but also the haptic sense that includes proprioceptive, play a role in our daily manipulation of objects and how we explore the world and how we perceive the world, and a little bit on its importance for human-robot interaction and of course haptic feedback. And I want to start off with this image that gives a little bit of a historical perspective. So this painting from Caravaggio is shown St. Thomas, which after the Christ is resuscitated. So St. Thomas actually doubts that he's really alive. So what he does is that he reaches and then pokes his finger into his wounds, and then by touching, he actually experiences the truth. And this has been culturally influential in the sense that for long the touch has been thought as a sense that is a ground truth of perception. If you touch something, you have a perfect understanding of it, and you have a true sense of what the world is. But what we actually know now with neuroscience, or thanks to neuroscience, is that the story is a little bit more nuanced, and visual information is actually giving a lot of prior on the perception of objects and the perception of materials itself. But first, I want to start off with a notion of haptic perception, so a little bit higher than just touch, and have you think about this simple task that is just like lifting a container, a water container, water bowl, and then pouring some water into a glass. So this, in a curious task that you do every day, probably did this morning. I want you just to think about what kind of cues we are, so sensory cues we are actually perceiving during that task. So think about yourself, like you have this glass that is in your hand. So what do you feel really? And you might feel two kind of sensations. One is really about like what happens to your skin. So how does the skin deforms and actually like transfer some energy. And so there's actually many cues which are transferred to that. It's not just contact, or it's not just pressure, but you also have information about temperature. You have so glass, for instance, might be a little bit cold compared to aluminum, for instance. It feels cold. You also have information about texture. So some aspect, it might be smooth, it might be rough, and so really with the cutaneous sense, you can feel that microgeometry of the object you have in hand. But more importantly, except the material property, you can also learn things about the state of contact itself. So how much the object slips, for instance, is it going to fall from grasp, and how much this object is alive by sensing vibration, and how much force it can be as well by the pressure it applies. So you get like, through this sense, you don't get just one degrees of freedom where you get like vibration and force, as you might think in terms of having like a robotic view on perception, but you get like a sense of the mechanical interaction, which is about the object, but also about the state of the contact itself. And on the other hand, you also have kinesthesia, which also called proprioception, which is another term, which provide you with information about the configuration of your limbs, the motion of your limbs, so how fast they can go, the force that can be applied by the muscles, and the compliance that you might have. So if you are uh, co-contracting or not co-contracting, so it gives you a lot of information on top of it, which is more about the limbs, how the limbs are positioned in place, and the dynamics of it. And all of this basically is combined by the brain into what we call haptic perception, and we really like have these two senses which work together as a control system, and that way we can really coordinate the movement, so make sure we can regulate our movement to make sure that the water doesn't flow too fast, that the glass doesn't slip from your grasp, and that you grasp correctly the handle, for instance. But also enables the flip side also enables perception. It also enables how you perceive the world in itself. Okay, and one thing that I want to show you is that maybe you don't realize it, but you use it really every day, and the best testament to that is that as soon as you don't have touch, it becomes very difficult to do anything, to interact with a small object or with distressed tasks. Is very difficult to do, and this little experiment is actually quite revealing. So in this video, it was asked to a lady to just lit a match, and so as you've seen, it's very easy. It takes 5 seconds to do it. But now they redone the experiment just by putting a slight anesthesia on the surface of the skin, so it really doesn't affect the muscles in themselves, but it just affects the sensation. So you basically the fingers and numb, and all of a sudden it's a little bit difficult to watch, but all of a sudden it becomes very, very difficult to grab and to orient and to put the proper pressure on the object for tasks that she might have done thousands of times in her life, right? And it takes 6 times that long, almost 30 seconds to do the same operation. So it's really, even though she knows exactly how to do the task, even though she has the muscle memory, the lack of tactile feedback about the actual state of the object in your hand, it completely destroys the motor command itself. And you might have experienced that as well when you are cold or when you have gloves, for instance. It becomes really difficult to do anything really precise, and that lack of sensation is really detrimental to any control. So before the advent of automation, a lot of work relied on our fine motor skills and our dexterous manipulation and how we shape the world, right? So a lot of object, a lot of production was really due to our ability to really control our movement and really feel how much wood you will chip away or how much clay you will shape like this. And so of course today we have CNCs and laser cutters and robots and everything that actually do this work for us and based on different kind of perception. But we still have like a lot of jobs which are usually related to medicine. We actually use the sense of touch in the case of human-machine interactions. And we were sold on this idea of having smartphones and having tablets. But if you think about it, like any professional, anyone that really types on his computer actually won't do it with a screen, with a touch screen. Because there is no actual feedback of where your finger are, did you press correctly, so there's actually very little tactile feedback, even though the visual feedback is here. Because you don't have this tactile feedback, usually you're pretty slow at it, and the experience is not good. It takes a lot of mental effort to use vision to compensate for the lack of tactile information. And so it's something that has to be taken care into account when you design an environment that people have to interact with, and you design a machine interface. Probably if you want your user to be focused on a task, visual task, you want to give tactile cues to where you place your fingers, and if an action is correctly implemented, on how much force feedback you may have. And so the learning goals of this class is really like to give you a certain aspect of how touch is mediated, so how touch is going from the receptors to the physiology of touch in our skin, and how does those mechanoreceptor actually transmit information to the brain. And so I want to show you a little bit of the physiology of the bottom aspect, the peripheral aspect of touch. But then I want to show you also like how we go from those information, so those mechanoreceptors firing, to more mechanical properties of the environment, and how those mechanoreceptors might be excited in typical manipulations, so in typical grasping conditions. And I want to apply also like what you've seen last time, this concept of, I want you to apply to this concept of observation window to the sense of touch. And of course, like throughout the course, what I want to do is have you reflect on the importance of having tactile and kinesthetic feedback. So the same way vision is based on the laws of optics, and audition has to do with acoustics. If you think about touch, it really is a mechanical sense. And this interaction might not be as simple as one said. So perhaps you might have pretty definite sensation, but if you look at the deformation of the skin, it's actually pretty complex. And what our brain does is really like to take this complexity and kind of simplify, try to come back to this idea of having just physical objects. So really what the job of the brain is to take all that influx of information and try to reconstruct, oh, here there's a bump, this is a flat piece of glass, or something like this. And so to show that, like, this is two videos which I think are quite illuminating into showing the complexity of what was going on. And you can imagine that basically this is the contact with the skin, between the skin and of course, transparent object. But you can imagine that you have like a bunch of receptors which look at the strain, and from this strain you have to infer what is the I mean, the brain has to infer what is the shape that is perceived here. So here, this is the typical strain pattern that you might see when you go over a bump, and you see that the deformation is actually pretty complex. There is some where it's squeezing, some where it goes. You have dynamic effect, and so the interaction is pretty complex. And yet, what you perceive is probably just a bump. And the same is true when you just like moving your finger on a flat surface of a flat glass surface. You might have like stress pattern that actually move back and forth, very complex. And yet the only thing that you perceive is a flat and smooth piece of glass. So you have like a complex environment, but your brain somehow makes a distinction and create a sense of an object which is really invariant on how you interact with it. But one thing also like that happens is that there is a lot of filtering that is done. So actually, sense of touch, if you think about it, like has many receptors inside the skin, and all those receptors will be affected by the strain, the local strain of that is implied by the contact of an object. What you observe is actually you have like a filtering, because you press the skin, but the skin is a continuum medium, and so when you press it, you will have the stresses will diffuse throughout this body, and you will have, where you had like a sharp corner, you might have something which is more rounded and more filtered. And especially like I think it's quite revealed if you press like this line drawing that you have on the right. So these are just ridges like this. When you press them like this, what you see is that really at the surface you have concentration of strain basically. But if you go deeper and deeper into the tissue, you get a signal which is more filtered. And so now if you want to discriminate, two small objects which are smaller than the resolution that you might have 1 millimeter down into the skin, you might not see it. So there's the fundamental limit which is done really by the skin filtering the mechanical stresses which are on the surface. And so this mechanical filtering actually gives rise to some interesting illusions which are just mechanical illusions. And one what is quite easy to do is involves the comb. You should feel a bump that actually travels with the pen like this. But if you think about it, like all the teeth of the comb are doing is just moving back and forth. So they actually shear the skin like this. And instead of feeling a shear, you actually feel something which goes up and down compared to this middle layer. And another classical illusion that you can do as well. And all of this is just due to the fact that if you look at the stresses down in the skin, if you look at the stresses for shear or for compression, you have pretty much the same stresses down below at the mechanoreceptor level. So all those mechanoreceptors which are deeper in the skin actually receive an information which is completely biased and completely filtered. And the other thing as well is that there is another aspect of it that has to do more with the vibration. And so if you run your finger on a surface, if you tap, if you impact, you have a lot of vibration that will occur, and those vibrations actually travel down the skin and is integrated. So this is kind of an example. When you tap, you have a lot of energy that actually travels down the hand as well. And this pattern of vibration actually influence the way we perceive the world. So in a sense we have, and so now that we have a little bit of understanding of the mechanics, I would say, of the skin, I just want to go a little bit deeper into the mechanoreceptors. So of course the skin will deform, but we have to take that deformation, the skin has to take that deformation and then send action potential. And so we have deep into our tissues what's called mechanoreceptors, which basically are small transducers that takes skin deformation as an input and then send fire and then send action potentials to the brain. And those mechanoreceptors actually have different dynamics. So they respond differently at transient and vibratory response, and they have also different receptive fields. And the picture is really like this. So this is for the skin of the hand, and especially like the skin of the fingertips, where you have ridges on the top, and you have basically 4 types of mechanoreceptor, plus the temperature and pain receptors as well. And so the 4 types are listed in this slide, and the first, and they are like 2 of them are really close to the outer layers, right? So they are the Meissner corpuscle and the Merkel discs. So they are those corpuscles which are inside the papillary ridges. And both of them, they are really like, because they are quite close to the surface, they are really sensitive to local deformation. And so the Merkels are really sensitive to pressure, and so they will respond with a constant influx of action potential to indentation like this. But the Meissner, they're more like sensitive to transient deformation. So if you have rapid change of curvature of the skin, a rapid change of stresses of the skin, these mechanoreceptors will actually fire. And then you have 2 other types which are a little bit deeper into the tissue, which are the Pacinian corpuscles. Down below it looks like an onion, and this basically is very sensitive to vibration. So you can think of it as an accelerometer. So they're really sensitive to vibrations over large frequency bandwidth, but they're really poor at discriminating individual sensations. So you can stimulate a Pacinian in the palm, and the one from the finger will respond as well. So really like they sense a broad area, but they are really sensitive. So small deformation will actually give rise to a lot of action potential. And the last mechanoreceptor is what's called the Ruffini endings, and they are more sensitive to actually stretch of the skin. So they are placed especially where you have joints, and so in the skin which is around the joints. And what we believe is that they stretch when you bend your limbs. And the last thing that we see is that there's 2 fibers which are in the middle, and these are what's called the free nerve endings, and what they mediate is really temperature and also pain. So this is when stimulation becomes too high or temperature rises, they actually fire. So really we have like four categories, but these four categories you can see it as the time dependence, which is like either colon, so how do they respond to constant stimulus, so transient stimuli, and the other is really like the range at which we can, so what's called the receptive field, the range at which we can perceive the stimulation. And so the two first is what we saw earlier, is that the mechanoreceptor which are closer to the surface of the skin, and to the Merkel cells and Meissner cells, and these have really small receptive fields. So meaning that if you're not really close to this particular mechanoreceptor, so if the stimulation is a little bit far away, they won't respond at all. And then you have the type 2, which are deeper into the skin, and as we mentioned, they are the Ruffini's and the Pacinians, and as we mentioned, they are sensitive to wide to large areas. So basically anywhere, for the case of the Pacinian here, in the finger, anywhere in the finger where you stimulate, you will actually activate the Pacinian response. Of course, if you're right on top, you have an increased response of these particular mechanoreceptors. And then the other category is really how they adapt to stimulation. And so you have the slowly adapting mechanoreceptor, which are the Merkel cells and the Ruffini endings, and then the rapidly on the other side mechanoreceptors, which are the Meissner corpuscle and the Pacinian corpuscles. And so really like the slowly adapting, they give a sense of shape and a sense of texture, and also pressure, basically, because when you apply pressure to the skin, they will continuously, and you retain that pressure, they will continuously fire. They will fire a little bit more when you make contact and when you break contact, but basically they will fire. We call it slowly adapting because after a while, their response will go down, and that helps also like reduce the amount of action potential that goes back to the brain. Actually, one small anecdote is that right now you don't even realize, but your clothes that you are wearing, they are pressing against those slowly adapting mechanoreceptors, and your brain suppresses this sensation. So now that I made the remark, you should feel your clothes, right? Whereas you spend your day without thinking about it. So your brain and also your mechanoreceptor kind of adapt to the constant pressure, and to reduce the amount of information that exists. But then on the other side, you also have like those rapidly adapting mechanoreceptors, which are the Meissner corpuscle and the Pacinian corpuscles, and these really respond only when very transient. So there's a little diagram on the top that shows you that when you go from zero stimulation to and when you ramp up to an indentation or to a pressure, you will have a lot of action potential, and when you go down, actually gives you also like a transient. So they really are somehow high pass filtered mechanoreceptors, if you think. And basically you have these kind of mechanoreceptors pretty much throughout the body, but where you see the most is really inside the hand and inside the tip of your fingers. Why? Because this is how we interact with the world. The hand is really there to shape our world, right? And so this is our primary mean of interaction. And so of course, like we evolved to have more mechanoreceptors in that area. But really, when you interact with an object, you actually have all of these mechanoreceptors that are firing at the same time, but differently, with different stimulation, of course. And so here it's really a simple demonstration on how they behave. And so you remember you have the type 1, which are more concerned with local deformation. And so if you have like this cylinder with braille display, so you can really see that if you record some afferent, you will find quite a good correlation between the shape which is underneath, which is stroke onto the skin, and the motif of the patterns of activation of each individual afferent. So because the SA are really they will respond mostly to compression, so they will actually match very well the shape that you're perceiving. The array as well, because the stimulus is moving, actually shows some sense of motion. So there's a firing which is at the impact and then a little bit later. The SA2, which are mostly about the stretch, actually don't respond much at all because there is not that much motion of the skin. But the Pacinians, so the RA2, so the rapidly adapting type 2, they will fire all the time because you have the cylinder will actually constantly rotate around, and so you have this friction noise which actually gives a lot of information about what's going on. And something you want to really make sure that people will be able to pick it up. What you want to do is excite the SA1 as much as possible, and to do so actually the best is to do with high curvature objects. So if you have like a needle, they will respond way more than if it's flat surfaces. And so that's why usually if you look at your keyboard right now and you have on the F key and the J key, you have this little rib, and so these ribs really are designed in such a way that they excite as much as possible these SA1s, these mechanoreceptors. So really, if you want to excite as much, so if you want to make a pattern, Braille displays are also the same. Having those high curvature objects actually are very useful to give some indication of texture. So the other thing is, if you want to put spatial deformation, but you want to put many of them, so it's probably something you want to do. And you want people to be able to discriminate them, have 2 points. There's actually a limit of how closely packed you can put those tactile indicator, basically a tactile rib, and because there is what's called the 2-point threshold. And so basically what the 2-point threshold says is that if you have two stimulations which are close enough, you will perceive them as only having one. In the tip of the finger, it's usually like about 2 millimeters, so you can poke your finger with 2 points separate from 2 millimeters, you will feel them, but if you're closer than that, it will appear as one. If you have a roommate or someone around, maybe you can ask them to poke you in the back, because it's quite difficult in the back, and you can see really, like, if they poke you with 2 fingers which are less than 2 or 3 centimeters, you will feel only one sensation. But as soon as you're largely spaced, you can actually feel. So there is like a spatial resolution, if you want, on how much you can pack spatial information, but you can discriminate basically. And so it's also true with more complex interaction. It actually gives a spacing which is a little bit smaller. So these are like 3 kind of experiments that you can run. So finding grooves, difference in grooves, or orientation of gradings, or even like a letter identification. And what it says basically is that for features, at least in the fingertips, for features which are smaller than 1 millimeter, really we are pretty bad at it. The only way to actually enhance that is to start exploring. And because when you do that, you actually have like a more complex interaction. So you start to have impacts, you start to have vibration. So imagine going yourself on this grading. They will create like a sinusoidal kind of, or at least a periodic kind of stimulus. And in that case, you can integrate information from the Pacinian, from those vibration-sensitive mechanoreceptors, which actually respond very well to a very small deflection of the skin. So in this slide, what I want to go over is a little bit explore how we perceive vibration as well, because I think this is the second thing which is quite important into our tactile perception is our sensitivity to vibration itself. And mainly our sensitivity to vibration is really driven by those pacinians, which are these onion shaped mechanoreceptors. And really, if you look at how they respond, so if you have, so the first line here, if you have like a stimulus that goes up and down like this, the only time it will respond is really where you have a sudden change of, of pressure and then a sudden decrease of pressure. So each transient, you're basically going to have an action potential, so the neuron's going to fire. But they also respond to continuous periodic stimulation. So especially like if you have sinusoidal stimulus, they will lock in with this sinusoid and they will fire in unison with the sinusoid. So and because they are so big and because they integrate energy for such a large radius, they usually are pretty sensitive. And so the graphs below, they basically show the human perceptual threshold. So this is what is the minimum amount of deflection of the skin at a particular frequency that would lead to a conscious perception. And you can see that this threshold can be pretty low, down to about nanometers, around like 200 hertz. But they will increase pretty highly in the lower frequency. So you might have like 10 micrometers at 10 hertz. So you really have this sensitive area, and really why is because you have those pacinians which ideally respond at that particular frequency. So again, when you're interacting with objects, all of the mechanoreceptors might be stimulated, but they don't respond the same way to vibration. And the low end, so everything that is below 20 hertz, something like this, is really due to those, to the perception is really given by those surface mechanoreceptors, the Meissner corpuscles and the Merkel cells. But everything that has to do with higher than 20 hertz, really driven by the Pacinian corpuscles. So it gives you so really that dip in perception, so that increased sensitivity is really given by these Pacinian corpuscles. But of course, also like as we've seen, sensitivity is also better in the fingertips, but if you go to the forearm, or if you go to the abdomen, to the rest of the body, you will need more amplitude to reach the same level of perception, of vibration sensitivity. So far we've seen how the skin deforms based on certain interactions, and how the deformation of the skin actually is encoded by the mechanoreceptors that transduce the deformation, the vibration, and the curvature into action potentials. But the brain also does a lot of filtering. And one way to think about it is really to think about it in terms of gestalt. And especially one thing which is, I think, quite important is this idea of good continuity. So in vision, it's pretty well known, and perhaps you've experienced that. But if I show you this picture, your brain will directly say, well, there is a triangle which is made with a line, which is occulted by basically another triangle. So what you see is like the three dots with this triangle below it, and then this white triangle that basically shade the other thing. But if you think about it in terms of visual stimulus, all you have is few lines, right? Your brain actually reconstructs all those shapes based on this good continuity principle. And so that idea is actually quite similar also in touch as well. So if you grab an object, if you think about it like mechanicalistically, what you have is a notion of this interaction at each of the contact points, and you might also have like the shape of your hand. So that gives you basically like 5 points of contact. But what your brain is interpreting is, I have a can of soda in my hand, right? So you have this cylinder which is reconstructed. So you actually use that idea, or use that prior that you if you have curvature on each of the contact points and something which falls along the side, you will reconstruct that into an object. And so that is true for spatial integration. So you usually can interpolate a sensation, but actually it's true also in temporal integration. I think this is where the engineer might be a little bit more cautious. Is that, for instance, if you send like let's say you want to send a stimulus, which is a sine wave, so you just want to say like wake up, wake up, wake up every 500 milliseconds, so every half seconds for half seconds. So you give that stimulus, but maybe you are in the car and there's a little bit of vibration. And basically, if you have a noise which is in the same order of magnitude than the stimulus, basically because the energy, like the vibratory energy is here, even though you have gaps of almost 500 milliseconds of stimulus, you actually feel that as a continuous perception. So your brain actually fills in the gap and create like a continuous stimulation, even though you have noise in between, or you have different stimulus that is there. So there is the effect of masking, and there is the effect of basically extrapolating the information of this. So it works particularly well if you have overlap in between the stimulus and the noise, meaning that if you have gaps, usually it's pretty salient and people would notice it. What it does as well is that you can actually trick the brain a little bit, and this is like a famous illusion as well, but it's quite useful if you think about it, if you want to extend spatial temporal patterns. So if you do exactly how it's pictured, meaning that you tap 4 or 5 times in one location, and then at the same time, a little bit later than the second or the third stimulation, you start tapping on another one, your brain will actually interpolate and make you feel that you have a stimulation that actually travels down the arm or travels down the finger. And so it's very useful because you can have only 2 actuators and you can do some kind of interpolation. So you do like vibratory signals which are synced, and you can do some interpolation, and it gives the sensation of having a continuous motion from one point to another. And so the last thing I want to go in is it's also like, as we talked at the very beginning, the sense of touch is really important for planning and executing motion as well. And so one way we think about it is through this sensory motor loop, where we have like descending pathways which go what we get afferent. And so basically our brain like decide and plan and control some action. It sends it as an action potential that will create a certain muscular activity, and you might have the biomechanics, so the muscle activity will provide displacement and velocity to the muscles and the limb. And of course at some point you will end up with a contact with an object, and that contact will give rise to like a spatial temporal strain that will be interpreted and then sent back as action potential and went back to the central processing of touch stimuli. And what is quite interesting is that if you look at the areas in the brain where the motor and the somatosensory, so the sense of touch, they are really close by, really neighbors basically, whereas the visual is really behind and the auditory is more like in the middle. The motor and the tactile really are close by, and they communicate quite a lot. So there is, in fact, quite a bit of a loop that is going on, and might explain why it's so important for manipulating. And so one way to think about it as well is like the contribution of each of the mechanoreceptors during grasp. If you take that simple example of I'm picking up an object, squeezing it, lifting it, holding it, and then lowering it back and relax the grasp, actually you have a lot of things that are going on. And so you can see it as at different states. So you have like the hand contact, so you have like more, you will start to increase the grip force, so the force you grip, and then you will start to load it to start to lift your arm, but the object will still have this weight. And as soon as the weight and the load force are balanced, you will have the object that is actually lifting, and so you will hold it and then go back down to the table, and you might have an impact when you're touching the table, for instance, and that gives a release. And at each of those individual subtasks, you have a different pattern of activation. And really, what we see when you start to have contact, you have information across the board from this rapidly adapting afferent that will fire because you have a large transient, but also like the slowly adapting Merkel cells that gives rise to that will start to have more and more activation. And so all this information, all this ensemble of action potential, they will give you information about location, about the timing, about the direction of forces, about friction, about the shape, the local shape that you may have, all about like how you shape this pattern of activation. And you must start lifting, and here what you have is like the SA1, they will continuously fire because you have this pressure that you're applying all the time. But if for instance you have a little bit of slippage, if it's making or breaking contacts, for instance, you might have the Pacinian also respond really quickly and create a feedback loop that will increase slightly the grip force, just to regulate and make sure that you don't slip. So you're always in a margin where you have a tight grip, but not too tight so it doesn't break anything. And the reverse is true as well. When you break contact, you will have the Pacinians, which are firing, encode the idea of you have a transient between pressure and then no pressure at all. So you have a relaxation, or you have a table contact, for instance. And the interesting thing here is that you have two SA2, so two Ruffinis. So you remember this is the mechanoreceptor which are sensitive to stretch, and those two, they are quite different, and they actually behave quite the opposite, and they are in this case believe that one side of the finger and the other side, and they're really more about the stretch that there is on the skin. And then of course like you have all this release response. The SA1 will stop firing. The RA1 we have, because you have a rapid deformation of the skin, they will start to fire again, and of course the Pacinians as well. So I hope now that it's pretty evident that touch actually feeds a lot of information to shape and to regulate manipulation. But the reverse is also true, meaning that if you want to have an information about the object itself, usually what happens is that you have exploratory procedures. So you actually command certain exploration procedures, certain movement, to actually gather more information. And this is due as well to the fact that a touch is really limited to contact, so you have to basically scan your fingers, or you have to explore the world to gather this information, which is quite different from what you can have with vision, where you have a pretty good sense of the speciality of things at the first glance. And what Klatsky and Lederman has found as common knowledge is that if you ask people to evaluate texture or to evaluate hardness or temperature, they will have pretty stereotypical exploration procedures. So texture, you might want to go like back and forth like this. Hardness, you're going to press. Temperature, you're going to stay in contact. Weight, you're going to hold it and maybe shake it a little bit to give some inertia. Global shape, you will go around. And so the way if you want your user to extract information, you have to have them kind of explore some interface like this. So with that, I would like to conclude this quick lecture on touch. And yeah, the take-home message I want you to have is basically that touch mediates some information about the world, and especially like the deformation through the deformation of the skin, and it will mediate like information such as shape or compliance of an object, but also all the information which has to do with the interaction itself, so the grip forces you might have, the slippage you might have with this object, or the through the deformation of the skin itself, so through this local global deformation. The other medium by which you actually gather information is really about this vibration, so the vibrotactile perception that gives more information about contact, impact, rapid, transient, and everything that has to do with texture and micrometer, micro scale information that you get when you're sliding on surfaces. But of course, there is also like different afferents that, especially like temperature and pain, which we didn't talk too much, but are also present and also gives a better idea of the mechanical scene. But one thing I really want to keep and to take home is that really, if you want to perceive well, you really need to have some kind of movement. So of course you can use vibro-tactile feedback for giving information, like your phone is ringing in your pocket or some cars are vibrating when you know something is going wrong. But I think when it really shines, where this kind of feedback, like this tactile feedback, really shines in machines, is when it actually informs on the motion itself. So if you think about the button, when you click, you actually press, and it's really like this click gives you a confirmation of that pressing motion. So you have this action from the user, and it gives rise to a sensation behind it. And it's really within this relationship between environment and the tactile sense that is really what touch is all about. And we've seen that it's really essential for regulating complex motion and complex movements because of this tight link between motion and sensory information. And I think if you want to make it well, if you want to do a good rendering of haptic feedback and tactile feedback, really what you need to do is have a way to measure user intention. So how much you slide on a touchpad, how much you press on a key to actually send back information. So this is how you will maximize the reception of your message.